And all I need to say that it is obviously a very, very interesting topic that we have to discuss this evening. Turkey's reputation as being a welcoming country to migrants from all sorts of different backgrounds, of course, has been sustained for several hundred years, if not more. And it's a topic that we should think about more. So it's a very, very great privilege to welcome Kemal Kirişci to talk about it this evening. And we will turn the floor over to him. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David. Thank you to you all for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank Chidem too for connecting me with you, and also Craig for giving me the technical support to prepare a PowerPoint presentation for a Zoom event. I hope you'll be patient and bear with me if things don't move at the pace that I would prefer if we were in a real world. I'm going to now load or share my PowerPoint. I hope I get it right. Oh no, this is... Okay, I hope you're all able to see the screen. Maybe just as I get started, David, allow me to be a little more specific, and rather than employ the term migrants, today I'll be focusing specifically on refugees. And not necessarily refugees themselves, but actually the refugee policies that Turkey has followed since its inception. And the inception of Turkey comes 2 years on the heel, or 2-3 years on the heel of the international community, which at the time corresponded basically to Europe, started to develop the current international refugee protection regime. So Turkey will be entering its centenary very soon, and the international refugee system, if you wish, regime with its institutions and norms, and then gradually with the convention, has been around for almost a century as well. Actually, last year was the 70th anniversary of the adoption of what you will see is called the Magna Carta for refugees. Now, what makes Turkey special these days, or unique, if you wish, although this may change with what is unfolding just north of us here. I'm on the Bosphorus right across from Andy Finkel. Turkey right now, since 2014, is the country that is hosting the largest number of refugees in the world. You see the figure for Syrian refugees, but then there are also about 320,000 asylum seekers as opposed to refugees, and a trickle of refugees. Now, the purpose of this presentation today is to basically survey how Turkey's policies have evolved over that century, and then also how it has interacted with the international refugee regime, with its institutions, as well as its norms and principles. One thing I'd like to underline before I go any further this presentation is not about asylum seekers and refugees from Turkey. There's been lots of waves of it. If there is interest in the Q&A section, we can address that topic as well. Now, I apologize for this crowded slide here, but in 2013, Turkey, let me reword it, only in 2013, Turkey adopted its first fully fledged refugee-related legislation. It's a major piece of legislative art, if I can call it. If there's interest, we can also go into the details of how it was penned. It was penned by a Mülkiye Müfettişi, a special inspector in 2008, very briefly, after Human Rights Watch published a report concerning the irregular migrant and asylum seekers detention centers appalling state. The person is a good friend I knew from the late 90s. The piece was called Revolving Doors, I think, if I'm not mistaken, their report. But it was a very damning report that originally was supposed to address only pushbacks from Greece and Bulgaria into Turkey. However, this friend and colleagues, what he encountered in the field in Thrace, in these detention centers, led him to go to cover also what was unfolding in Turkey. Fascinatingly, this took place in 2008. The then Interior Minister instructed this inspector to study the problem, and one thing led to the other, and he became involved in drafting this piece of legislation. I am very ambitious, I know. If I claim, I would be ambitious, but I'm prepared to claim that this was probably the most democratically drafted piece of legislation in the history of the Turkish Republic, I'm tempted to argue, because this person, a friend and a colleague now, did consult civil society, consulted the European Commission. Much more interestingly, he actually flew to Strasbourg and consulted with the officials and the judges there who had been involved in passing rulings against Turkey with respect to its violations concerning the rights of asylum seekers. Right. So the starting point here is the definition in this piece of legislation. I highlighted the part that I would like to flag out to you, because towards the end of my presentation, I will share with you the origins of the terms events occurring in Europe. Refugee definition in the legal sense of the word is built around the notion of the person, which would be an asylum seeker, experiencing a fear of persecution. It's not necessarily persecution, it's the fear of persecution that results from the person's race, religion, nationality, membership to a social group or political opinion. That's one part of it. The second part of it, that the person, the asylum seeker, is outside of his country of origin, citizenship, or nationality. Thirdly, this person is unwilling, unable to seek the protection of the state authorities of the country he's a citizen for. Thirdly, fourthly, not willing to return to his country of origin. And then finally, and most importantly, and that's the bit towards the end of the quotation, that the person becomes a refugee as opposed to asylum seeker as a result of a refugee status determination process, which states put into place. But in the case of Turkey, we will see until 2018, for all intent and purposes, status determination was being done by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Now, because unlike Britain, unlike Switzerland, unlike Sweden, unlike members of the European Union countries, and unlike the majority of countries that have acceded to the 1951 convention that I will come back to later on, but refer to very briefly, Turkey is amongst 3 countries, I will come back to who those countries are, that still grants refugee status to people who are fleeing their country or experiencing a fear of persecution as a result of events occurring in Europe. This is why, unlike in all those countries that I have made references to, this piece of legislation has this conditional refugee terminology. And a conditional refugee is a person basically that fulfills all the requirements of the definition, the first definition of a refugee, but comes from outside Europe and is granted conditional refugee status until their resettlement from Turkey. The figure that I shared with you earlier on in itself suggests that that kind of resettlement compared to the past years, especially the Cold War, is occurring less and less. Subsidiary protection is a very common form of protection that one finds in Europe, in the United States, and many other countries. It's a protection that doesn't extend as far as a refugee status falls short, but offers non-refoulement guarantee, non-refoulement being the promise not to send the person back to where the person may be experiencing one of the outcomes that is stated in the definition. Finally, and very importantly, given that there are 3.7 million Syrian refugees in Turkey right now, there is the status of temporary protection in this law. And temporary protection, you may have picked up from the media coverage of Ukrainian refugees, have just been granted by the European Union for Ukrainians too. So this notion of temporary protection was inserted in this law from a European Union directive dating back from 2001, drafted or put together on the heels of the experience of what had happened in the former displacement that had occurred as a result of what had happened in the former Yugoslavia throughout the 1990s. The European Union has invoked it for the first time. Turkey adopted the notion in this law, but invoked it ahead of the European Union for the Syrian refugees. What it does, temporary protection, it basically extends temporary protection, but grants pretty much all the rights that one would, almost all the rights that a refugee, a fully fledged convention refugee would enjoy. So much for the tougher definitional issues. And now I'd like to say a few very general words about this century-long journey and then take a nosedive. Craig assured me that I would have all the time in the world this evening, so I hope you can put up with me. If you can't, I'm assuming Craig will intervene at some point and tell me to start wrapping up issues. I've allowed myself 40 minutes, but I fear it may go beyond that. The origins of the journey starts with the League of Nations setting up the High Commissioner for Refugees in 1920, and then appointing this famous personality that I'm sure you've all have heard, Nansen, the Norwegian explorer, who had made a name for himself towards the end of the First World War with respect to the repatriation of prisoners of war, but also people who had been displaced from their home. Now, let me just speed up. At the time, there was already a consensus that people who are fleeing persecution and violence deserved international protection, and from then on, the system began to evolve. By the time we get to the aftermath of the Second World War, we have the UNHCR and the convention that gets adopted, which I have very briefly already mentioned. Now, Turkey, in the initial stages, in the League of Nations stages, was very much passive, but was engaged by the League of Nations. I will go share some of the details, but once the UNHCR and convention emerge, to outsiders, it may come as a surprise, became an active participant, starting with the drafting of the convention itself. The origins of the modern refugee regimes, although recognizing that the notion of refugee has existed since time immemorial. Time is limited, I won't go into the details of it. But what is significant from the First World War onwards compared to the past, the granting of refugee status was the business, the power of sovereign states and empires, and you can push this as far back as it's done in the Bible to Adam and Eve. And in the case of Islam, the experience of the Prophet Muhammad when he was chased out of Mecca to Medina is known as Hijrat, and is basically him becoming a refugee in Medina. Now, what makes the World War I itself, but also the period running up to it, is what Lord Curzon called the unmixing of people. What I call humbly, you may object to me, is the encounter between nationalism and the imperial order. And again, I need not go into the details of the consequences of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Romanovs, not to mention the Hohenzollern Empire in Northern Europe. The dissolution of and the conflicts that stood at the heart of these empires led to what Lord Curzon called the unmixing of people, and with that unmixing came the challenge of addressing its consequences. First World War just aggravated the issue, and this way, by the end of the First World War, you had more than 5 million Russians, 2 million Poles, more than 1 million Armenians, Greeks and Turks and Hungarians, Germans, the list goes on. And the international community that was transforming itself from empires to what sometimes people call the modern nation-state system, was facing a crisis of humanity. And the need of international cooperation had become evident or obvious. However, what often is missed out is that it was not purely humanitarian and altruistic protection concerns that drove this international cooperation. There was a lot of need to address the political and economic stability issues, concerns about how these refugees are going to impact these efforts to build the nations or nation states, aspirations of having homogeneous societies. So it was also a recognition that these issues themselves needed to be addressed internationally, as refugees, ironically or paradoxically, as they are still today, often seen as threats to receiving countries and intruders. And for that purpose, I have this quote from the Italian representative at the League of Nations that is in quotation here: refugees sowing dangerous seeds of strife and unrest. I think you would find similar remarks being made by politicians and representatives of states of today. In some ways, this gives one an impression as if a whole century has gone by, but not much distance has been covered. That actually would be unfair. Here is Nansen himself, a very impressive looking person. I wish I had his mustaches there and could do without my eyebrows, would prefer his. But he did leave his imprint. I will expand on it. As I move further on, I completely forgot to share with you that I have sent to Craig a longer version, an even longer version of this presentation with references and additional reading material, etc. Now, the first stage of the institutionalization of the refugee protection issue occurred, I like referring to H. Carr there, during the 20 years crisis. And that it occurred during this crisis period, I think needs to be given some credit to. The first step took the form of the High Commissioner for Refugees being instituted with Nansen at its head. An important development occurred with the adoption of the Convention relating to the international status of refugees in 1933. Only 9 ratifications. Today, the Geneva Convention has almost 150 ratifications. It was very European-centered. And then, because of the complexity of politics and diplomacy in Europe, a separate commissioner for refugees coming from Germany from 1933 onwards, and I'm sure you know the reasons for it, was appointed. To deal with those refugees, a separate convention was adopted, initially for refugees fleeing Germany, but also subsequently refugees fleeing other areas that came under Nazi rule, was incorporated into this convention, but it only had 3 ratifications. And with the passing away of Nansen, these different offices were merged into one just before the Second World War, and that position survived the Second World War and continued to perform its functions. And here I'd like to elaborate a little bit on the details of this protection regime as it emerges. Now, one striking aspect of this regime compared to today's, and that's reflected in the definition that I shared with you at the very beginning of the presentation, is that the focus is not on the individual, but on the group. And the group that is addressed is the group that is unable or unwilling to enjoy or receive the protection from the governments of countries that they were part of. And the Bolshevik Revolution resulted in in that Russian displacement. I made references to, but bear in mind the size of that displacement is much larger than the figure here, because that would have included prisoners of war, victims of war who were subsequently returned or had been repatriated to what would become eventually the Soviet Union. These are what often are referred to as white Russians. I will come back to the issue in the context of Turkey. And then there were the Armenians. I don't need to go into the details of it, but 320,000 of them were mostly in European countries, some in Middle Eastern countries, without or unable to enjoy the protection of the Ottoman Empire that had disappeared, and then the Turkish Republic. Again, in the context of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, again, coming out of the Turkish geography are the Assyrians, Chaldeans, the Turkish and assimilated refugees, roughly 30,000. Assimilated refugees referred to here to Kurds. And then what is not mentioned, but is included in the arrangements, and that's what they called in the context of the League of Nations, as opposed to resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, arrangements, there were also the 150'likler. 150'likler is a long story. I won't go into the details of it, but these 150 Ottoman subjects in the context of Lausanne Treaty had been banned from the Turkish Republic. What were these people? And then subsequently the Saar refugees, once Hitler annexed Saar region of what is today Germany, Germans, Austrians, Spaniards, Italians fleeing fascist regimes, and then Sudetenland refugees, that is, the non-Germans, mostly Czechs, who had to flee the Sudetenland after it was annexed taken over by Hitler's Germany. What did they enjoy? What were they granted? They were granted a legal protection in the sense that their existence were recognized by the countries in which they ended up residing, and then eventually an identity certificate was developed that would come to be known as the Nansen passport, which would allow them to travel between countries, and attached to the Nansen passport was the right to return to the country where the passport was issued. And then the High Commissioner's Office had also the duties that are listed here to perform. But most importantly is the emergence of what today's refugee regime calls durable solutions. And I will come back to durable solution problems in the context of today's Turkey. The notion that they are either repatriated voluntarily, resettled, or naturalized. Nansen office took care of these issues, looked for jobs with the ILO, very interesting, and then also provided humanitarian assistance and consular services. The kinds of things that are actually occurring right now in Turkey under the umbrella of the law that I made references to. Most significant is the codification of the norm of non-refoulement in 1933 convention. Even if it may have only had 9 ratifications, I think by then non-refoulement was beginning to become a customary rule of law. Here is an example of the document that would be known as the Nansen Certificate of Identity, which came to be called a passport there. What about Turkey? Turkey did not become a member of the League until July 1932. Some of you may be familiar that there was a sort of resentment towards the League of Nations in Turkey right throughout the 20s. And I won't go into the details of it, but it had to do with Musul and other issues. The young Turkish Republic very much saw the League of Nations as a Western institution discriminating against this emerging Turkish republic. But fascinatingly, this Turkish Republic, right throughout the 20s and 30s, even independently of that resentment, cooperated with the League of Nations. Nansen, it's not often known in Turkey in the context of the Lausanne Treaty, was very much involved in this Greek-Turkish population exchange. Today, such population exchanges in international law are unacceptable, but in that context, it was considered as a solution to a problem that otherwise could have escalated into yet another war. And Nansen is recognized as the person who enabled the process of adopting this convention with all its intricacies and procedures, etc. Much more interestingly, maybe, was his office involvement in protecting white Russians in Turkey, in the Turkish Republic. I will come back to it in the next slide. But in the Turkish context, white Russians are basically non-Muslims, because there were also many Muslim refugees that fled the collapse of the Russian Empire and its replacement by the Soviet or by the Bolshevik system there. Nansen office was also involved in arranging for the extension of the stay of these white Russians and provided employment possibilities, and this was against or in spite of the fact that 20s and 30s was very much marked by legislation being adopted to nationalize the Turkish economy, which basically meant discriminating against minorities and foreigners in Turkey. And eventually, the office also succeeded in persuading the Turkish side to allow some naturalizations to take place. Here are some details very, very quickly. Once the Bolsheviks prevailed in the Soviet Union, there were these 126 ships that sailed across the Black Sea, arriving to what was Constantinople at the time under Allied occupation, partly military personnel and partly their families. Many of them were housed or camped in Çatalca and as well as in Gallipoli. But there were also these Muslim Russians that came from the Caucasus through Sarıkamış and Erzurum, that area. Most of these white Russians left what became in the meantime the Turkish Republic. But in the 20s, there were 8,000 of them. And by 1935, 3,000 of them remained. The Büyük Millet Meclisi, before it became Türkiye Büyük Millet Meclisi, the Grand National Assembly, adopted legislation in 1922 extending a kind of temporary protection. Not many people in Turkey dealing with refugee issues today. There's a very vibrant academic and civil society addressing the challenges of Syrian and other refugees in Turkey, would be aware that the Turkish Republic, before it had become the Republic, had already adopted a temporary protection scheme in 1922, allowing for their stay for 5 years, and this was extended in a number of times. And during the extension processes, they were also given the right to work in Turkey. For example, when Atatürk came to Trabzon in the late 20s, apparently they couldn't find a driver, and it was a white Russian former officer that was assigned to drive Atatürk's car on the occasion. But what is also very little known is the impact that the white Russians had on Turkish modernization in both social but also in the industrial sense of the word, just as the Soviet Union was engaged in the industrialization of Turkey. And in that context, here is the general himself with his family in Istanbul before he very quickly left Turkey. Here are two faces of white Russians, well-off ones, as opposed to the ones who have to find a living from the leftovers in the streets of Constantinople. And here is a person to which I have some attachment. I never met him, but he was the founder of the Karpic restaurant in Ankara. I have vague recollections of my parents taking me to the second location of Karpic restaurant in Ulus, and I have vague recollections of this long, windy corridor. But by then, I think Karpic was gone. And in that context, I'll let you read the remark by the famous Turkish writer Nurullah Ataç, who says Karpic taught us how to dine, and there are many such quotations. There's an excellent, very recent article by a young Turkish academic, Pınar Üre, who has published a fascinating article on the impact that these white Russians had on Turkish society, economy, and in industrialization. And one fascinating example is how, while the Karabük iron and steel factory, those of you who might have seen it, I've seen it near Safranbolu, and you can immediately understand why in the 30s they would have chosen the area, the place where they chose to have this. The factory was mostly run by Soviets, or there was Soviet support for it, but in it there were white Russian engineers, and that, I think, very much said about the Turkish Republic's pragmatism. And here is, of course, the Soviet refugees. I haven't done archival work, so I have to confess this, but I suspect there must have been other Soviet refugees in Turkey, maybe not as prominent as Trotsky himself, particularly because until 1936, until Stalin embarked on his famous nasty policies, the border between the Turkish Republic and the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic was open. And Yashar Yakış, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, told me the story how with the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the first things he'd done was to cross the border and go and dig up his family that had been left on the other side of the border when the border was closed under the instructions of Stalin. Turkey's had also the Austrian and Jewish refugees that came by. I'm realizing that time is flying by, and I'm not even halfway there, so I'm going to speed up.
Kemal, don't hurry. Please take your time. The world will carry on turning. Absolutely. Just carry on. Take as much time as you like.
All right, that comes as a surprise. Thanks. As Hitler came to power, I'm sure you're all familiar how his opponents, and especially the Jews of Germany, were left in a very difficult situation. And at a time, a bit like today, the doors of European countries and the United States was closing to Jewish refugees who were trying to flee Germany. Some of them, especially university professors and intellectuals, were able to make it to Turkey. The story behind it is a very fascinating story and is linked to the efforts in Turkey to transform the old Istanbul University, known as Darülfünun, into a modern university in Istanbul and in Ankara on the basis of a report that a Swiss university professor had prepared. And that report coincided with the efforts of another professor, Philip Schwartz, who had put together an association to try to help university professors from Germany, mostly Jewish, find jobs elsewhere. I can't help and think what happened to Turkish academics recently when they signed that peace petition and then ended up losing their jobs, and the international community in Europe and in the United States created mechanism that has allowed some of them to travel to those countries and remain there for a while until it became possible for them to return to Turkey. There are different figures that are being cited in the literature, ranging from conservative 550 to 1,000, mostly Jewish intellectuals, including their families. Now, beside them, there were also German Jews who were employed in Istanbul in many German companies and institutions, who found themselves out of work under instructions coming from Germany's Hitlerite regime. And they did not have a status. And they, a bit like in today's Syrian refugees, often eked a living through illegal employment. Thirdly, there was also Jewish refugees that came through Turkey on their way to Palestine. There too, different figures are being cited. I've also come across 100,000 in Shaw's book on the Ottoman Empire. Interestingly, in the case of Jewish refugees, the League of Nations did not play a particularly prominent role in Turkey. The story of these refugees in Turkey is a mixed one, and there's roughly three perspectives. There's one I summarized that looks at their presence in Turkey as Turkey providing them a safe haven. There are even those who have argued that Istanbul University became the best German university in the world in those years. And a very interesting argument, I thought, that the Turkish Republic provided this intellectual capital, a kind of escrow account that eventually enabled these people to go on to America, Israel, and the new Germany. And we must not forget that these people came to Turkish universities at a time when American universities were not admitting Jewish intellectuals and academics. And in one of the publications I worked with, there was a quotation from Roosevelt himself, who was objecting to one of the Ivy League universities, I can't remember which one, Harvard or Princeton, because they were admitting too many Jewish academics into their faculty. This is late 1930s. And then there's another perspective, and in my list of reading material, this is Corey Gottstad's book, extremely critical of Turkey, and arguing that maybe to a certain degree rightly, that Turkey was not a country of asylum for persecuted Jews, as sometimes Turkish publications, especially official publications, make it out to be, and offers, for example, Albert Einstein's letter you're going to see, where he pleads with İsmet İnönü to allow 40-odd Jewish German academics jobs that they would be prepared to accept without pay, and this does not occur. And in that book, it's a very well-researched book, very much depending on archival issues. There's also details of complications put in the way of refugees trying to transit Turkey. And then there's a position in between, and I've cited that particular quite recent article by Stuart Roth, who argues and very much makes references to Gottstad's book, and concludes that in spite of all the problems, the limitations, that one had to recognize that the Turkish Republic in the Europe of the time had steadfastly resisted active collaboration with Hitler's final solution. And then there's also that tradition that goes back to 1492 that I firsthand, and if there's interest, I can go into the anecdote, firsthand experience and learned about the continuation of this tradition, 1492 tradition, well into the 60s and 70s, that was shared with me by a retired Turkish ambassador. Here's a typical picture of those academics, and depicting the safe haven nature of Turkey for them. The other side of the medallion is, of course, the Struma disaster that occurred in February 1942, when this rickety ship that had made its way from Romania to the Istanbul harbor was on its last legs, was pulled back into the Black Sea and was torpedoed by an unidentified submarine. However, the sad story is that one encounters similar situations in today's Mediterranean Sea, though the vessels look very different. Now, 1930s was also marked by İskan Kanunu, law on settlement, that corresponded to the law that I made references earlier on. Very different in nature, very different in content as well. What that law defined was that only individuals of Turkish descent and culture would be permitted to settle, and only refugees of that origin could remain in Turkey permanently. Others could be granted only temporary protection, but the term temporary protection was not part of the law itself. Refugees were, immigrants were divided into two parts: individuals, serbest immigrants who would make their way into Turkey at the time and then after the Second World War, and then those who were supported by the state, but İskanlı immigrants ended in 1970. Now, some of you may be familiar with İskan Kanunu. Time is limited. I won't go into the details of it. But the country was divided into 3 zones. I had worked on this on this law when I was working on the book on the Kurdish question with Garrett Winrow back in the mid-1990s, and that's also the time when I came across Peter Andrews. I missed most of his presentation from last week, and his map. And interestingly, his map was sitting at the Turkish Forum, one of the walls of the Turkish Forum ministry. But at the time, Turkey was divided into 3 zones that were dominated by people of Turkish descent and speaking Turkish, into which you could move other people or settle people coming from any background, and parts of Turkey into which you could not settle people who did not speak Turkish, and then zones from where you had to move people. And this was a beautiful piece of, beautiful may not be the appropriate word to use, but a legislation of social engineering to craft a nation state. But these zones were ended in 1946 with Turkey's gradual transition into the democracy. I won't go into the details of it. This table shows to you the number of national refugees, I call them, who moved from overwhelmingly from the Balkan countries into Turkey over this long period, amounting to more than 1.6 million people. For a long time, Turkey was known as a country of emigration, overlooking the fact that there was also this particular angle of Turkey. Second World War also saw the continuation of that institutionalization process that had started between the 2 world wars. The difference may be from the First World War was the scale of displacement. 60 million people is calculated to have been displaced during the war, and at the end of the war you had 20 million refugees that needed to be managed. So the need for international cooperation was clearly even more urgent than was the case after the First World War. But that cooperation continued throughout the Second World War. In the benefit of time, I'm not going to go into the details of it, and you see the emergence of these organizations trying to address the issue of displacement during the war itself. And the UN Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Agency, and not the UNHCR, became the first UN agency to deal with refugees during and in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And then for reasons to do with the Cold War beginning to make itself felt, and the US interest in wanting to exclude the Soviet Union, you see the emergence of the International Refugee Organization that folded pre-Second World War organizations and those organizations that were put together during the Second World War into the IRO. But again, problems to do with the Cold War, the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries, etc., led the Senate to cut funding for IRO, and instead the effort was launched that would lead to the establishment of UNHCR. Now, Turkey worked with these agencies, even if Turkey was not a member of these agencies. Now, throughout the Second World War, you had about 67,000 refugees that came to Turkey, plus interned Axis and Allied soldiers. Most of these refugees were Greeks and Italians fleeing the Dede Koniz Islands, or Oniki Adalar, as we call them, and overwhelmingly they were repatriated. German citizens were interned in Turkey once diplomatic relations were severe. And then there was this interesting case of surplus refugees, often representatives of neighboring countries that refused to return once these countries came under communist rule. By June 1948, June 1948, the IRO transported to its headquarters or regional center, Italy, refugees that would then be resettled. The traffic in the other direction, and here is another anecdote. Very few people know that I have a Swiss side to myself. My mom and dad met during the Second World War in Switzerland, where my dad was studying as an Air Force officer in Biel-Bienne. And my dad once told me how after the war in Biel-Bienne, majority German-speaking, minority Francophones, he would recall Uzbek soldiers in full uniform riding horses, Soviet uniforms, riding their horses. They were interned Second World War soldiers. The problem at the time was that part of the tension I made references to was the issue of repatriation of prisoners of war, displaced people, and refugees to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was very demanding in ensuring that they would, but then there were those who would not want to return, and Turkey volunteered to take the Muslim refugees, and it was the IRO that organized their transfer to Turkey. So by the end of the Second World War, and as the new system was emerging, there were about a little more than 4,000 refugees in Turkey. And here is, we're finally approaching the end of the presentation. Craig, are you sure that I can keep going on?
Yes, just take your time.
I hope there won't be people dropping dead because of the length of this presentation here. As the Second World War came, and in Washington, D.C., I picked up this term, international liberal order, or more specifically, US-led international liberal order. And part of this emerging international liberal order was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that had codified the right to asylum, but not necessarily the right to enjoy asylum. And the part to do with enjoying asylum was critical to the establishment of the UNHCR, as a separate organization, and then the adoption of the convention. Here comes where we started with. My first slide had highlighted sections in yellow, and that's where we're coming back to it. I won't, again, the process of preparing the convention took a long time, and it was a very tense and long drawn out process. And the reason for it being long drawn out had to do with the definition of refugees. And the source of that tension had to do whether the convention that was being adopted would have a definition of refugees that would be applicable to current refugees, or would it also apply to refugees in the future? Some countries were in support of a universal definition of refugees, and many, including Europe, including the United States, wanted a more narrowly defined definition. And this is the context in which events occurring before 1 January 1951 came up. And then there was another source of tension, which was whether this definition would apply across the world, or would it apply only to Europe. And that culminated, the tension was eventually resolved, and that's the beauty of diplomacy, by enabling acceding countries to make the choice at the bottom of this slide. So a country signing the convention or ratifying it to this day could make a choice. I correct myself, not to this day, I will explain it. At the time in 1951, you could choose the convention to apply to events occurring in Europe before 1 January 1951. That's what Turkey did. Or you could choose events occurring in Europe or elsewhere before 1 January 1951. The New York Protocol of 1967 gave countries, states, the possibility to lift what was known as the temporal limitation and the geographical limitation. Some countries lifted both, some lifted only the temporal limitation. And that's what Turkey did. In other words, Turkey lifted the temporal limitation, but not the geographical one. At the very beginning of my presentation, I pointed out how, compared to interwar years, Turkey became more and more engaged in the post-World War II international refugee system. One of the manifestation of this was this gentleman who sits at the right side of the table when we're looking at it. Talat Miraz was one of the two vice presidents to the plenipotentiary conference that would finalize the convention and adopt it. And the colleague, I hope he's with us, that as a guest was to join this event, Metin Çorabatır, heads this little think tank, but very impactful think tank / NGO in Ankara. He worked as the UNHCR spokesman in Ankara from 1995 until a few years ago. And last year, they instituted this award, one for Talat Miras and one little known English lady who during the latter part of the 19th century, time of Florence Nightingale and all these other missionaries that were very keen supporting Christian victims of wars, etc., but were ignoring the Muslims, this English lady went out of her way to try to support Muslim refugees in the Ottoman Empire or victims of victims of war in the latter part of the 19th century. Turkey did not ratify the convention until 1962, and some of you who are familiar with Turkish history, the person that made the ratification possible was Alparslan Türkeş, of all the people. So today, there are 3 countries that still maintain that geographical limitation, and they are Congo and Madagascar together with Turkey. And until a year or 2 ago, Morocco was on that list too, but it looks like they have withdrawn that geographical limitation. Turkey also has reservations, which is very different. The limitation is embedded in the convention. The reservation is what states bring from outside the treaty. And I will let you click on the Article 1A to discover what exactly Turkey brought its reservation, which is not very surprising. And since then, Turkey has been a part of the executive committee, an active body that meets periodically and prepares, if you wish, soft legislation compared to hard legislation in the form of the convention, which is regarded as an international treaty. How did the application of the convention manifest itself during the Cold War? In a nutshell, I don't know about you, but I'm about to collapse, so I need to start speeding this process. And in a nutshell, what happened during most of the Cold War is that asylum seekers basically came from the Soviet bloc countries. Usually right here, across from me and across from Andrew Finkel, where he is, they would jump ships. And usually fishermen, and then the Turkish intelligence services in Bebek. I remember from my university years in the first half of 70s at Boğaziçi University, 2 very good-looking, powerful yachts moored right next to the Bebek Mosque. And I didn't know about this at the time, but subsequently was told that these 2 powerful yachts were provided by the United States precisely to go out and fish Soviet or Soviet bloc refugees jumping off ships, but also approach Soviet shipping with Geigers to measure whether there was any radiation being emitted. Most of these refugees were resettled overwhelmingly from Turkey, although a few stayed on. And even though the Geneva Convention would have allowed them to stay on, overwhelmingly these people preferred to move on. and my speculation from conversations I've had over the years with officials and diplomats, etc., is the influence of also the law on settlement from 1934 that created a conflict in many ways between the law and the convention itself. One person that I came to meet who stayed on was an Hungarian, the gentleman in the middle, who was the founder of the Ankara Atletizm Kulübü. In my high school years and university years, I was in track and field. I wasn't part of this club. I competed for Galatasaray Kulübü, but I remember him very distinctly. And he used to run a lamp shop in Ankara. Unfortunately, I have no idea what's happened to him. He must have passed away. Interestingly, at the time when I was actively doing track and field, there were two Hungarian coaches. Kovacs and Soltan was the other one. And on one occasion, as a visiting professor in America in the late 90s, I tried to dig him up and found his daughter and found out that he had passed away only a few weeks earlier than my call. It was sad. I, though, never knew whether these were coaches that had been sent by the Hungarian government or whether they were coaches that were refugees at the time. National refugees during the Cold War, that continued from Bulgaria in two ways, one in the 50s into the 60s, and then also in 1989. There's a fascinating story. There's the reference from it from a National Geographical article from 1954 of these Turkic people, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Uyghurs making their way from China in the late 30s, and then eventually also after Mao came to power through the Himalayas and arriving in Turkey in the 1950s. There were some prominent names amongst them, and I remember them from my youth. Large arrivals came from Yugoslavia, and because of the definition in the law on settlement, Turkish descent culture, the culture part covered Bosnians, Circassian, Albanians, Pomaks, and Tatars, even if they did not necessarily speak Turkish. There's that mass influx. It was Zhivkov policies of, in many ways, ethnic cleansing. The term didn't exist at the time. And then in the 90s came the Bosnian Muslims and Kosovars on temporary protection. There were also these special laws that were adopted because in 1970 İskamlı göçmen was discontinued. Laws were adopted to cover these particular Turkic refugees. Here is a picture from 1989. It kind of reminds me of what's going on right now on the Ukrainian-Polish border. And then there's the case of non-convention refugees. Those are the refugees that results from events occurring in Europe terminology. Before the end of the Cold War in Turkey, we began to see more and more Iranians coming, and then Iraqis, and then nationals practically from everywhere around the world. Today, the majority of those 320,000 are Afghans and Iraqis. There was the mass influx of Kurdish refugees in 1988 and in 1991. What is fascinating is the way in which the 1989 mass influx of Bulgarian Turks and Pomaks was handled and managed compared to the mass influx of Kurdish refugees from northern Iraq. The two were handled very differently. The victims of the first one were incorporated, integrated into Turkey very quickly with special legislation. In the case of the Kurdish influx, Turkey played a very, how should I say, forceful diplomatic effort put into place that culminated in Resolution 688, which created this no-fly zone. That there's a lot of talk about those no-fly zones today, which enabled the overwhelming majority of these refugees to return back to northern Iraq as part of this Operation Provide Comfort. And you see those refugees here as they come through the mountains. And then that's the Resolution 688, which was drafted in Ankara and then faxed. At the time, there was no emails, faxed to New York, picked up by the French presidency of the Security Council, and pretty much word by word adopted, culminated in the creation of these zones, enabling their repatriation. The experience of these mass influxes of refugees led to the adoption of Turkey's first regulation, not law, but regulation governing asylum into Turkey. I remember those years very well. I was very much involved in refugee issues, knew the officials. Actually, I knew in person the official that put this together. He was, at the time, the law from 2013 also created, I forgot to mention, the Directorate for the General Directorate for the Management of Migration. Until then, it was the police that was managing asylum issues, and the person that drafted this regulation came from a hardcore police background in Turkey, and that is reflected in the letter as well as spirit of that regulation, which, when it began to be implemented and generated a lot of criticism in human rights circles, but also from the Department of State and in their annual human rights reports. That kind of criticism, just like the 2008 Human Rights Report, those criticism triggered a quasi-reform process that I'll come back to very briefly in the next slide. What I want to mention here is that the number of asylum seekers in Turkey through the 90s and early 2000 were 2,000 to 3,000 per year. Now, by 2015, they had reached 64,000. And 2 years ago, before the pandemic, it had reached well above 100,000 per year. Okay? So there's been a steady increase in the number of individuals seeking asylum in Turkey. And the tradition of resettling refugees, which was very strong during the Cold War, has weakened and trickled to just a couple of thousand a year, far from meeting the quotas that UNHCR has sought for resettlements. UNHCR thumb role for resettlement is 10% of a refugee population in a particular country. Then came the Syrian refugees in 2011, and then on the right-hand side is some of them making their way to Europe in 2015. Very briefly, the reform process and how we got to that definition at the very start of the presentation. Craig, is still everybody there surviving this?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I can see Chidam and Simon, they look alive, but I can't see the rest of you. So.
Well, if you offer a conclusion, we can have a nice discussion.
Yeah, I'm almost there. I'm almost there.
Fine, no problem.
I think this is the slide. Again, I mean, for me, this is exciting because I observed the firsthand and then published an article with a colleague, which is cited in the long version, this reform process. The criticism, and this is what is fascinating, international criticism of the implementation of this asylum regulation that was leading to increasing cases of refoulement, meaning violation of the non-refoulement convention from the convention. It led to the UNHCR to engage the Turkish police, and then the prosecutors and the judges, and then the gendarmerie in the form of training programs, in the form of raising awareness of the convention. I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes, an international organization engaging their counterparts. And I also saw with my own eyes the impact that it was having. And by 1999 and then 2006, there were amendments brought to this asylum regulation, which significantly cut the level of refoulements. But by the time we come to 2006, there was also this fantasy of Turkey's accession process to the European Union. Right? And that accession process also played a role in paving the way to the adoption of the law in 2013. Now, the European Union demanded from Turkey to adopt its asylum acquis, which would have required Turkey to lift the geographical limitation. Whereas Turkey said, I will lift this when I become a member of the European Union, which to me made a lot of sense. But by the time the 2013 law was adopted, the European Commission, in its progress report of 2014, found the law and the conditional refugee status satisfactory, which I thought was very interesting. Craig, I think I maybe should stop here. I won't go into the Syrian refugee scene. It's a topic on its own. They are in a temporary protection status. In this slide, the fourth point is very interesting. As the years have gone by, Syrian refugees the proportion of Syrian refugees in this periodically taken poll by a good friend, and there's a reference for it, who say they won't return under any circumstances, has been increasing. And these Syrian refugees who've been polled increasingly feel they are integrated into the country. And when the Turks are asked, they recognize that these refugees will not return, but over the years, increasingly, they are demanding that they should be sent back. And they also feel that Syrian refugees are not becoming integrated. And that's a huge challenge, the biggest challenge that faces Turkey today. And then there's the challenge of these young kids, children, 1 million of them, more than 1 million. Some of them are in the schooling system. They are literally becoming Turks. What will become of their future? And then finally, the greatest challenge is this beautiful quote from a former High Commissioner whom I had the honor to meet and serve in one of her committees, Sadako Ogata, who made that observation there, that the modern system emerged in Europe, but increasingly the system is being tested. And she was making that remark in 1992. And today, if she was around, I think she would simply say that Europe is failing that test she is referring to. Now, against this challenge, where will the law from 2013 stand and how it will be applied? Time will tell, but doesn't look very promising. Craig. Thank you all for your patience. I hope you're still alive, but I promise you, in my 7-8 years at Brookings Institution, I had learned to be much briefer than this, but blame it on Craig. He provoked me into this. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much for a marvelous talk. If you stop sharing your screen,
okay,
we can come together. Now, of course, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind, of course, straight away is Andrew and Cyril Mango, who were descended from a white Russian family, spoke Russian at home, lived very close, of course, to where you are, and in comparative terms. And then, even though they did leave Turkey, they carried on making an extraordinarily important contribution, even from Britain. So that international aspect that you rightly drew attention to just carried on over time. Well, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions that people have. But just to start things off, could I just ask you for your impression of something? Of course, Turkey also accepted many earlier waves as the Ottoman Empire was rolled back in the Balkans. So what did they regard these people when they came into the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century? Did they say refugee, or did they use another term? How was it kind of done?
Muhajir.
They always said more, even for the, they said muhajir for whether they were rural peasants or comparatively wealthy Ottoman citizens coming back to Istanbul. The same kind of expression would be used.
I cannot speak on that period as confidently, but if you're ever interested, I have a former student called Erol Ülker, who is very familiar with the transition from the Ottoman Empire into the Turkish system on these issues. And then there's another Turkish academic called Fuat Dündar, who has a wealth of experience on the topic that you're addressing, and has just published a book on Osmanlı'da göç, on migration in the Ottoman Empire. You have really raised a fascinating question, in my teaching and in my presentations, sometimes I do refer to refugee experience in the Ottoman Empire. But I have to admit that I use Western terminology when I do it. And you just made me realize that I should have been much more sensitive and, for example, looked at the term that the Ottoman authorities used, for example, for the Hungarian nationalist Kossuth. I forgot his first name. He ended up going on to the United States and becoming a US citizen. And then there's the grandfather of Nazım Hikmet, who was a Polish count. Again, I can't remember his name, but he became Muslim, and he was known as Mustafa Celaleddin Pasha. Right. So there are lots of such characters. Now you made me curious as to what word the Ottoman authorities used for them, as opposed to for what they called muhajir, and muhajir usually is Muslim. All right. So I wonder what term they used. As I said, in a way, unprofessionally, I just kept using refugees. Maybe they used a different term.
Well, I can see there's already a response or a question from Mohammed. Please go ahead.
Thank you, David. Thanks for organizing this lecture, and also thanks for Kemal, whom I have read some of his analysis for some years, especially when I was in Istanbul between 2015 and 2018. My question is, I asked it actually in the chat, but I will say it out loud so everyone can hear it. In which ways do you think that the Turkish nationalization of Syrian migrants in Turkey have an effect, either positively or negatively, on the Turkish domestic politics? An example would be, will those naturalized Syrian migrants vote for a Turkish party over another? For example, the AKP over another one? And thanks.
The issue of extending Turkish citizenship to Syrian refugees first came up, I think, in 2016. It was the Turkish president that brought this up at the time, and he met such a furious reaction, including from within the ranks of his political party, and he did not bring up the issue until very recently. And there's been a similar reaction to it. And the issue that you just referred to, that he wants to use them as a electoral base that would vote for him. So opposition parties resisted, and again, for other reasons, supporters of AKP resisted as well. And this is reflected in the survey that I made references to. In the long version of this presentation, there is a reference to the survey, and I think a link as well. And one of the questions that the Turkish side is asked, Turkish respondent is asked, what do you fear the most about Syrian refugees? And they are also asked about whether they should be granted citizenship or not. On the list of what you fear the most about Syrian refugees is them becoming Turkish citizens, being granted. And when they are asked whether citizenship should be granted, overwhelmingly they object to it. And This is why in my concluding slide, I made that reference that this is the biggest challenge that is facing Turkey. On the one hand, you have refugees that have become, for all intent and purposes, integrated into Turkey. It's not a perfect integration. Their life is far from being heavenly. And then on the other side, there is this reaction from the Turkish public against their presence compared to what it was when they first began to arrive. And the term that I didn't employ is Ansari Muslim. Erdogan and AKP in the early days of the crisis, let's say, or the influx, very much emphasized this element, that they, meaning the Turkish public, was a bit like the residents of Medina, who were receiving with open arms the Prophet and his entourage. And this went very well with the public at the time. But the mood has changed very significantly. And David, in many ways, this also relates to the question you raised earlier on. I think there's some connection there, in the sense that in the early days of the crisis, politicians, AKP people, and people in government did not employ the language of the 1954 Geneva Convention, or the language of what, you know, a humble academic like me would use, the international refugee regime. They chose to use language from Islam, from religion, to with support for it. Bureaucracy is different. Bureaucracy worked on the basis of the legislation. Interestingly, the legislation was adopted as the crisis was gathering. The number of refugees arriving was constantly increasing. This is a miracle, because this legislation was adopted in the parliament almost unanimously. There was cross-party support for this legislation. There is no way this kind of legislation could be adopted today. The legislation is still in place. The problem has more to do with implementation. I have not seen, Mohammed, a study of where these people would cast their vote if they had Turkish citizenship, and I don't know which way those Syrians that have acquired Turkish citizenship vote, or whether they have voted for that matter. I think the number is around 190,000 right now. This colleague who runs these surveys does have a fascinating article in the Uluslararası İlişkiler dergisi on how party politics in Turkey is being impacted by this particular issue at hand. One last point I'd like to make on this citizenship issue. He argues that this citizenship issue should be much more transparent. It lacks transparency, and that also aggravates this resentment towards citizenship being extended to Syrian refugees. He argues that if the government was more transparent, and if the conditions, the requirements for citizenship were openly defined, and the process of who is applying, who is getting citizenship, why they're getting the citizenship was more transparent, he speculates the resentment would be less. But the government on this issue is being less and less transparent over the years. I, as an academic, used to have access to refugee asylum seekers related statistics much more easily than I do today. And there's a whole bureaucracy that is supposed to track these statistics and make them available. So it's a sensitive, very difficult issue. And one last point I'd like to make, I'm a very cautious tweeter. You know, I try not to get involved in controversies because of the kind of language that sometimes is employed in social media, and I have an extremely thin skin. The only area where I get attacked is on this issue, with most colleagues that advocate the idea that more effort should be put into integration, and that eventually integration inevitably would have to mean, you know, citizenship, although it would have to be transparent, this and that. I really get brutally attacked. And the other day there was a tweet saying that, Prof, you know, the likelihood of discovering petroleum on the moon is much higher than Syrians becoming integrated into Turkey. I don't say anything because if I attempt to respond, I risk getting butchered, probably.
That's really interesting. I think Chidem wanted to say something next. You're next in the queue, Chidem, go ahead.
Thank you, Kemal. This was a brilliant presentation, and the recording will be very useful for the students. It will be great. While you were talking about citizenship, it reminded me the situation of the Meskhetians, the Ahuska Türkleri. I worked with the Ahuska Türkleri, this was before Erdogan's time, in Bursa. And then I worked with them later on, after 2000, in America. As you know, the Meskhetians or Ahuska Türkleri came after the Fergana Valley, and then they were moved to Russia, and then etc. And then from Fergana they came to Turkey. Some of them, they tried to get citizenship for decades, and I don't know what happened later on, but only their children born in Turkey later got citizenship. And these were people who were vetted to be of Turkic origin, because some Meskhetians are of Kurdish origin or other unknown origins, but speak Turkish. Although they spoke Turkish, they were Turkic origin, proven, they had to prove. They were not given citizenship. So I never looked into it. I think a very interesting comparison between what happens or happened in the Ahuska case, Meskhetian case, and with the Syrian case. So this, let's not make them into citizens. It's not only for the Syrians, but for the Meskhetians as well, the Ahuska Türkleri. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's really fascinating. One of the laws that I did not dwell in detail in one of the slides towards the end of the question was a law that was adopted in 1992, enabling about 500 Ahuska or Meskhetian Turks to be moved, I think, from Georgia into Iğdır area, that area. I have not followed it in detail, but there were also many Meskhetian Ahuska Turks, like others, who came to Turkey through a facilitated regime. You know, there are lots of Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Ukrainians, Moldavians, etc. That's a whole different area of study, if you wish. Once Turkey from the late 80s started to liberalize its visa regimes, there were many people who came to Turkey for all kinds of reasons. And an area that I've never studied, and I don't know if any other person has done, is that some people use that for refuge purposes. And this is happening right now with Russians and Ukrainians, especially Russian. Ukrainians can flee to the European Union. They can choose their destination. They have protection. They're welcomed, but Russians are not. And Russians who are against Putin and against this war have nowhere else to go but come here. And they are able to come here because of this liberal visa policy. But that liberal visa policy, thanks to the European Union and to the process, allows them to stay in Turkey for a specific duration. I think it's 90 days, and in total, 2 times 90 days in 365 days, right? So at some point, I am suspecting and speculating that the DGMM, the Directorate General for Migration and Management, is going to face asylum demands, I suspect. And it will be interesting to see how they're going to respond to that. Will they respond to it within the realm of the law, which should allow them to be granted refugee status, or will the government respond to in a manner similar to the way they responded to Chechens? Because there were many Chechens that came to Turkey during and aftermath of what happened in Chechenistan, all right? But they were discouraged from applying for asylum. Had they applied for asylum, should have been granted under the convention. The law didn't exist at the time. They were permitted to stay on. I'm not very sure under what status. Today, they probably would be granted that subsidiary protection. Yeah, but the relationship with Russia and the president's relationship with Putin, etc., may impact these things. I'm not sure, may not, especially after I saw the vote that they cast at the UN General Assembly today. One last point I'd like to make, as this presentation went out of control, I failed to mention one brilliant article that talks about the problem you are referring to in relation to Iraqi Turkmens and Bulgarian Turks. And the article is called Nafile Vatandaşlık. It's penned by a former student, Didem Danış, and her colleague, the daughter of Tahap, a former colleague of ours, Ayşe Park. I've never known how they translated Nafile Vatandaşlık to English. But their argument is like yours in the sense that as far as the İskan Kanunu, the reformed version of 2006, they should be able to acquire Turkish citizenship because they are of Turkish descent or culture. But I think with the end of the Cold War, the Turkish government or state has adopted this policy that Turks should stay where they are. Yeah, and that really started with Turks from Western Thrace. I think it started in the early 60s. It may be linked to the way in which the İsmet İnönü government deported Greek citizens of, residents Istanbul residents of Greek citizenship in 1964, because there was an agreement between, not many people remember this, but there was a treaty that was signed between Greece and Turkey in 1929-30 that allowed Greek citizens to come and work in Turkey, reside in Turkey. And the people that got thrown out of Turkey in 1964 because of what was happening in Cyprus were these people.
Well, thank you. We've got time for just one more question, I'm afraid, because we always stop after 2 hours. Although, of course, this is a fascinating one. I don't know whether, Andy, please go ahead.
Okay, well, I was going to sort of do my chimes at midnight with Kemal and say how I met the last survivor, the only survivor of the Struma when he came to Istanbul. There was a plan to sort of try and find the remains of the ship that had been torpedoed by a Russian submarine. How Mumtaz Soysal said that this was an attempt to undermine Turkey. It provoked memories even then. But my question was, well, perhaps it's a fanciful one, but I was always sort of slightly surprised. I think, I mean, the events that you mentioned were the events that I, sort of sharpened my teeth as a journalist on, the flight of the Bulgarian Turks to Turkey, and then of course the Kurdish refugees in '91. And of course these two events were treated very differently by the populations and by the government. One accepted, one were rejected. But I always thought that there was a much greater tolerance, certainly when the Syrians first started coming to Turkey, in Turkey than most other countries, certainly those in Europe. And I often wondered if an explanation for this wasn't the fact that Turkey itself was a country of not so much migrants, but immigrants, that everyone in Turkey had come from somewhere else. That in the city of Istanbul of 17 million, the number of people who were actually born in Istanbul. I mean, I've probably been here longer than most Turks, and whether the fact that this is a country of had somehow allowed people to assimilate and tolerate the notion that people from elsewhere could be accepted, and that there wasn't this sense of possession in place, which there is, say, in neighborhoods in London or whatever, where there's a suspicion of foreigners, and of, even if you like the person who lives next door, you don't like the idea of foreigners in general. I wonder if this is, and then of course, they might have been stayed and could vote and could be co-opted into a political machine. That may have been the factor, as you said, which ended this tolerance. I wonder if this is a fanciful theory or not.
I'm not a sociologist, but I feel that this welcoming of refugees, whether they are in Turkey or elsewhere, wears out after a while. And anecdotal, personal experience, I've observed that people somehow from modest backgrounds, and often the kind of people you're referring to, that is internal migrants, coming from rural area into Istanbul, tend to have a more modest background in the economic sense of the word compared to the settled people of Istanbul. Anecdotally, seems to welcome the Syrian refugees and expressed a kind of lived solidarity with them more than the others. However, that has worn out as well. Mm-hmm. And one area where I experienced it firsthand is Sultanbeyli. In Sultanbeyli, the municipality, and I have to recognize that municipalities, by and large in Turkey, have been doing a grand job, and they are internationally recognized for doing a grand job in managing, addressing, and also integrating refugees in Turkey, accumulating in experience. Some are more welcoming, more open-minded than others. Sultanbeyli, the municipality, leads them all. And I have talked to them, I visited them. Others also say, one of them, I frankly think deserves the Nansen Award that UNHCR gives out. And when I had a long chat with him, he said, we make all this effort, we mobilize little resources we have to bring together the refugees and the locals in Sultanbeyli. And you have no idea how disappointing and hurtful it becomes when you organize a breakfast gathering and for the women, and it's only the Syrian women who come. And then the challenge for us is to address that disappointment which is on their faces. And this is Sultanbeyli. This is the bedrock of AKP.
Yeah.
And it's also a modest area. That was really disappointing for me as someone who has, worked with these issues for such a long time. To see such a dedicated, open-minded. I mean, he sounded to me more like a Swedish social democrat of 10 years ago, 15 years ago. He knew his topic, he knew his values, he knew the convention, he knew the international standards, and was trying to make his best. But the expression on his face when he reflected on the disappointment of the Syrian women to see that their counterparts had not come to the table and what that meant. He really conveyed it so well to me at a personal level, and I'm sure he does. And then when I asked him, how is it that you are able to run this mülteci merkezi in Sultanbeyli in a country where this resentment is increasing? He said, it's so important to have political backing. And he said, I'm very fortunate that the mayor of Sultanbeyli is 100% behind me. But I have had occasions when I've gone to other municipalities where I was almost beaten up, he said.
Mm. Interesting. No, I wouldn't. I know you have to end it. I just one quick response to that is, it sometimes seems to me that the rhetoric against the refugees is the same sort of rhetoric that we used to hear in the early 80s against the immigrants from, the making fun of the culture of the people who were coming from invading Islam. It's the same. It's the same people and the same rhetoric that's being used again, once again.
Yeah, I'm invited to a Mediascope program. It will be a series on this issue. And I really feel challenged on how to package this message that the world, for its weaknesses, minuses, etc., have put together this bundle of principles, laws, etc., and how important it is to abide with it, to implement it. And I'm dying to find a connection to the importance of addressing these atrocities that were committed in Bucha. That addressing that and addressing crimes against humanity, this and that, the significance of it is as important as providing this protection to refugees and implementing what has accumulated over the last 100 years. But I know people are going to get back to me and say, well, Western countries are not respecting it, are not implementing it. And then what do I say? You know, how do I defend this position?
Well, sadly, we always stop in 2 hours because, of course, people have families and dinners and no doubt burning in the oven and so on. But look, thank you so much for a talk that was so wide-ranging and so detailed and so thought-provoking. And all we can say is, in our wonderful society, we'll carry on coming back to these topics, I'm sure, and so we can carry on our discussion. So in the meantime,
thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity and for patiently listening to me. Craig, Dave, thank you to you all.